The neighborhood had always looked perfect from the outside. Manicured lawns, freshly painted fences, and immaculate sidewalks created the illusion of peace and order. But behind the pristine facades, a storm was brewing. At first, it was the small stuff, a fine for leaving a trash can out for an extra hour, a notice for a minor landscaping violation. Most people shrugged, paid the fines, and went on with their lives. But some of us, the ones who cared about our property rights and personal freedom, started to notice a disturbing pattern. The HOA wasn't just enforcing rules, they were wielding them like weapons. Every minor detail, from the color of your mailbox to the type of plants in your garden, could be scrutinized and punished. Residents whispered about the board's power, about how they seemed untouchable, how complaints to the management were dismissed, and how fines piled up like snowdrifts in winter. I had lived there for years, minding my own business, until one afternoon, a letter slid under my door that changed everything. It was written in the standard HOA font, crisp, cold, and official. But the content was aggressive, almost absurd. My backyard shed, which I had installed legally and had been there for 5 years, suddenly violated a clause buried deep in the HOA's rules, one that no one had ever enforced before. The penalty was severe, a fine that doubled if not paid within a week. They even hinted at further legal action if I dared to resist. I stared at the letter, disbelief turning into frustration. How could they have the audacity to penalize me for something so clearly established and harmless? But as I looked around, I realized I wasn't alone. Other neighbors were quietly fuming over fines, threats, and petty rules. The tension was palpable. People exchanged nervous glances at HOA meetings, the small talk masking the underlying resentment. Everyone had a story, a minor infraction turned nightmare, a garden deemed unacceptable, a garden deemed unacceptable, a paint color rejected. The HOA thrived on control, and fear was their currency. I started documenting everything. Every letter, every notice, every unreasonable demand. The more I dug, the more absurdities I uncovered. One resident had been fined for painting her front door red because it did not align with community aesthetics. Another had received a warning for installing solar panels, allegedly because it altered the neighborhood uniformity. The rules were arbitrary, selectively enforced, and often applied retroactively. It became clear that the HOA was no longer a community board, it had become a machine for intimidation. One evening, as I sat in my living room surrounded by stacks of letters and digital copies of HOA regulations, a thought struck me. If the board had built its power on rules, maybe it could be undone by them as well. I started combing through every document, every clause, every fine ever issued. I was looking for loopholes, for inconsistencies, for anything that could be leveraged against them. Hours turned into days. I uncovered hidden contradictions, vague wording, and procedural errors. And then I found it, the clause that changed everything. It was a rarely referenced section buried deep in the HOA's governing documents, a clause that stated the board could not enforce penalties without unanimous consent for certain types of fines. Even more importantly, it explicitly voided fines that had procedural errors or lacked proper notification. It was practically invisible in the stack of rules, but it was there, a ticking time bomb waiting to be activated. The possibilities raced through my mind. If I could use this clause correctly, I could challenge the board's authority and potentially nullify years of accumulated fines. But this wasn't just about the money, it was about standing up to the tyranny that had taken over our community. I knew the board was powerful, ruthless, and manipulative. They wouldn't give up easily. But sometimes, power built on fear is weaker than it appears. I started reaching out to neighbors quietly, sharing what I had discovered. Some were skeptical, afraid of retaliation. Others were quietly relieved to hear someone had found a way to fight back. We began strategizing, collecting evidence, making plans. Every small victory, like uncovering a procedural misstep or pointing out an illegal fine, felt like a spark lighting a fire. The tension in the neighborhood was palpable, but hope started creeping in alongside it. And then came the day I decided to act. I prepared a formal challenge, citing the clause that would dismantle the HOA's overreach. I attached every supporting document, every proof of error, and submitted it through the proper channels. I knew the response would be immediate and furious. The board had never faced a challenge like this before, and I had no illusions about the backlash that would follow. As the days passed, the neighborhood buzzed with anticipation. People whispered in their yards, exchanged nervous glances at meetings, and watched closely as emails and letters began circulating. The first ripples of disruption were subtle but unmistakable. Notices were returned, fines were delayed, and murmurs of internal panic within the HOA became apparent. The structure they had relied on for control was beginning to tremble. By the end of the week, tension reached a breaking point. The board held a meeting, their faces tight, voices defensive. They tried to maintain authority, to act as if nothing had changed. But the momentum had shifted. For the first time, residents questioned openly, challenged freely, and demanded explanations. The clause I had discovered had given them a tool to fight back, a wedge that exposed the fragility of the board's power. As the sun set over the pristine lawns and orderly streets, I realized that the neighborhood had crossed a threshold. The battle was far from over, but the tide was turning. The HOA that had once ruled with fear now faced the reality that its control could be contested, that its rules were not absolute. The seeds of change had been planted, and the community was waking up. And so, as night fell, the stage was set for the next chapter. The HOA had been pushed too far, and the challenge had begun. The clause was no longer just words on paper, it was a weapon. And soon, the full consequences of their overreach would unfold, shaking the foundations of the neighborhood they thought they owned. The days after submitting the challenge were electric. You could feel the nervous energy in the neighborhood, like a live wire stretched across every perfectly trimmed hedge and polished mailbox. People watched the HOA with new eyes, realizing that their iron grip wasn't unbreakable. Rumors spread faster than wildfire, whispers about fines being reversed, notices being rescinded, and board members acting strangely. It was as if the ground beneath the HOA had suddenly turned unstable. The board, of course, reacted predictably. At first, there were denials, passive-aggressive emails, letters claiming everything was in order, and attempts to intimidate anyone who dared mention the clause. But the beauty of legal loopholes is that they are objective. They don't bend under threats or fake authority. Every procedural misstep I had documented became a hammer striking at the facade of their control. Even small mistakes, when highlighted, revealed cracks in the armor they had built over years of fear and compliance. Residents who had once cowered at meetings began speaking up, asking pointed questions, referencing my challenge. Some were tentative, unsure if they could actually push back, but others were emboldened, seeing that the board's responses were weak, defensive, and inconsistent. The balance of power was shifting. For the first time, the HOA was facing something it couldn't control through threats or bureaucracy alone. As the week progressed, internal chaos started to emerge within the board. They argued in hushed tones, made frantic phone calls, and circulated memos to cover their tracks. Some members considered ignoring the clause, hoping it would go unnoticed. Others panicked at the thought of legal exposure, realizing that the fines they had collected over the years could be nullified. The air of authority they once carried had been replaced by fear, a fear that now belonged to them. Meanwhile, I kept documenting everything. Every misstep, every contradictory statement, every delay in enforcement was catalogued. It wasn't about revenge, it was about accountability. By now, several neighbors had joined my effort, sending copies of their fines and notices, corroborating the pattern of overreach. We were building an undeniable record, one that exposed the HOA for exactly what it had become, an institution built on selective enforcement, intimidation, and abuse of authority. Then came the first major victory. One of the oldest fines, dating back years, was officially voided after I challenged it under the clause. It was a small win, but symbolically massive. Word spread quickly. People began reviewing their own fines and noticing irregularities, procedural errors, and unfair penalties. Each reversal chipped away at the board's credibility. Where once they had been untouchable, now they were vulnerable. The neighborhood, long paralyzed by fear, started to wake up. But as with any fight against entrenched power, resistance intensified. The board launched counterattacks, threatening legal action, attempting to rewrite minor rules, and pushing procedural loopholes of their own. They tried to scare residents into silence. Emails and letters carried subtle veiled threats, and a few neighbors started to hesitate, afraid of retaliation. It was a tense, high-stakes chess game, each side carefully weighing every move. Yet, for every attempt at intimidation, the collective confidence of the residents grew. People began holding informal meetings in backyards, comparing notices, sharing strategies, and preparing for hearings. The neighborhood became a quiet, vigilant community army. Even minor acts, questioning a board member, filing a procedural complaint, documenting a notice, felt like a victory. The clause was no longer just a tool, it had become a rallying point, a symbol of resistance. One particularly dramatic moment came when the HOA attempted to enforce a fine for an alleged violation that had occurred years ago. The notice was poorly written, lacking proper signatures and failing to meet the procedural requirements clearly outlined in their own rules. Using the clause, I filed a formal objection. The result was immediate, the fine was not just dismissed, but the board was forced to acknowledge the error publicly. Residents were elated. The message was clear, even the most brazen attempts at control could be overturned. With momentum on our side, the challenge escalated. We started uncovering patterns of abuse, like selective enforcement targeting specific neighbors, arbitrary fines for minor aesthetic choices, and even instances of personal bias influencing board decisions. It was no longer just about reclaiming fairness for individual residents, it was about exposing systemic corruption within the HOA itself. The neighborhood had transformed into a tight-knit force, determined to see justice through. By the end of the second week, the board's authority had eroded significantly. Meetings that had once been dominated by their scripted power plays were now tense, with residents questioning every point, citing procedural clauses, and challenging each fine openly. The board tried to reassert control, but the residents had learned the rules, literally. Every action they took was now scrutinized, every decision dissected, and every threat countered. It was exhilarating, a community, long silenced by fear, finally taking a stand. People were no longer intimidated by petty fines or vague notices. The clause had unlocked a level of accountability the board had never anticipated. Each reversal, each challenge, each procedural victory reinforced the idea that power without fairness was fragile. As night fell over the neighborhood, a quiet satisfaction settled over the residents. The battle was far from over, but the direction was clear, the HOA could no longer operate with impunity. Their control had cracks, and those cracks were widening by the day. And as I reviewed the growing stack of overturned fines, formal objections, and documented errors, a realization dawned, this was bigger than me. The neighborhood had awakened, and the full consequences of the HOA's overreach were only just beginning to unfold. The stage was set for the final confrontation. The clause had been wielded, momentum had shifted, and the HOA could no longer hide behind fear. The next moves would determine whether the board survived or collapsed under the weight of its own abuses. And soon, every resident would witness just how far a determined community could go when pushed too far. The neighborhood had transformed. Streets that once held quiet, fearful tension now buzzed with energy. Residents were no longer silent observers, they were participants in a quiet revolution. The HOA, once untouchable, was teetering under the weight of procedural challenges, overturned fines, and public scrutiny. Every board member felt it, the fear that the rules they had wielded like weapons could now be turned against them. The culmination began quietly. Notices sent by the board were returned with corrections, objections, and formal disputes citing the clause. Every attempt to enforce fines without proper procedure was met with resistance. Even the most confident board members began faltering, their voices cracking in meetings, their emails defensive and aggressive. The illusion of control was slipping away faster than they could comprehend. Residents had grown bold. Meetings were no longer dominated by fear, they were arenas of accountability. Questions were sharp, pointed, and relentless. Fines that had once seemed permanent were being cancelled en masse, procedural errors exposed, and patterns of abuse documented in front of everyone. The HOA tried to regain authority through threats, but with each move, the clause I had uncovered became a shield, legally binding, undeniable, and unstoppable. One by one, the board members realized they had no options left. Attempts at intimidation, rewriting minor rules, or claiming retroactive authority all failed. The clause was precise, leaving no room for interpretation. It invalidated years of accumulated fines, demanded corrections, and, most importantly, placed the power firmly back in the hands of the residents. Every effort to circumvent it only strengthened the case against them. Power. As the meeting reached its peak, it became clear, the HOA could no longer function as it had. Years of fines, threats, and arbitrary rules were nullified. Procedural violations meant that the board's actions were legally compromised, leaving them vulnerable to accountability at every level. The power dynamic had shifted completely. Residents who had felt silenced for years now controlled the narrative, the rules, and the future of their community. The aftermath was immediate. Fines were reversed, notices withdrawn, and the board faced legal pressure to amend their procedures. Neighbors shared their stories widely, exposing patterns of abuse and selective enforcement. The clause had not just ended the board's reign of control, it had exposed a systemic failure that demanded reform. The HOA, as it had existed, could not continue. Its power had been dismantled, and its authority discredited. But beyond the legal victories, there was a deeper change. The neighborhood, once divided and fearful, had come together. People who had felt powerless found a voice, a community, and a sense of justice. The experience transformed ordinary residents into vigilant stewards of fairness, capable of holding authority accountable. Fear no longer ruled the streets, awareness and empowerment did. The board members who had once exuded authority now faced the consequences of their overreach. Some resigned quietly, others attempted damage control, but none could undo the collapse of their power. The clause had been the fulcrum, and once leveraged correctly, it toppled the structure that had seemed invincible. What remained was a community determined not to allow such tyranny to take root again. In the weeks following the final meeting, the neighborhood began to rebuild. Rules were revised with transparency, fines issued only with proper procedure, and residents became active participants in oversight. The balance of power had shifted permanently. The HOA, which had once been a symbol of fear and control, was now a cooperative entity accountable to the people it served. And through it all, the clause remained a reminder, a legal weapon that had restored balance, accountability, and justice. It had taken meticulous research, community coordination, and courage to wield it effectively. But when the residents acted together, even the most oppressive authority could be dismantled. The neighborhood had learned a vital lesson: power built on fear is fragile, and even the smallest legal leverage, when used wisely, can topple giants. As the sun set over the newly peaceful streets, the transformation was complete. The lawns remained manicured, the sidewalks clean, but beneath the surface, something far more important had changed. The residents had reclaimed control, dismantled abuse, and created a precedent that would protect the neighborhood for years to come. The HOA had been pushed too far, and in doing so, it had unleashed the power of an awakened community. What had started as a single letter, a single challenge, had evolved into a full-scale shift of authority. The clause had ended the board's reign, but more importantly, it had empowered the residents to defend their rights, protect their property, and ensure that fairness would always prevail. The neighborhood had survived the storm, stronger, wiser, and more united than ever before. The chapter closed not with triumph over a single adversary, but with the enduring lesson that vigilance, courage, and knowledge could defeat even the most entrenched power structures. And in the streets that had once been ruled by fear, laughter, conversation, and community thrived, a testament to the fact that no overreach, no matter how powerful, can withstand an informed and united populace.